So, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about a critical cornerstone concept in marketing, which is called STP, segmentation, targeting, and positioning. And as I said last time, marketing concepts aren't difficult to understand, but they're significantly more difficult to execute than you might realize. So, I'm going to go through and I'm going to provide some examples. I'm going to talk about each part of this. The area that is most difficult, as I'll uh, discuss near the end, is positioning, and I'll explain what those are. So, what is STP? Segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So, we use the abbreviation STP. It's fundamental marketing model that helps businesses effectively engage in their desired audience. And what it really allows you to do is to tailor your strategies to meet specific customer segments. So as we go through this, what I want you to think about and what's really critical is how are you thinking about segmenting the market? And what it requires, and we'll talk about this near the end, it requires really understanding the customer, or in the plural customers, and what I call the customer chain, which is not just the end user, but the intermediaries that affect the decision process. And so we'll go through a number of examples, some of which are going to come from business schools, just because I think you're more familiar with those, and some will come from corporate America. So the elements of STP, segmentation is the first step. It's how you divide a market into distinct groups that have shared characteristics or similar attitudes. And I'll go through what 5 different types of segmentation, and I'll talk about the fact that segmentation has really changed because of the ability to have large databases. Then we're going to talk about targeting, identifying which segments to go after. This is a critical decision. If you go after the wrong segments, you can have your business can fail. And obviously, in entrepreneurship, we talk about the word pivoting. And some of the great examples are organizations that started out targeting one set of segments, pivoted, and became successful because they identified a different set of targets. And then the last is positioning. And this may not be a concept you really know, but what it involves is crafting a unique image and message for the product or service. It's what we think about as a tagline. We talked about last time, if you attended, talking about USP, unique selling proposition. And positioning is closely linked to USP. And so what it really is it's how the customer perceives the product relative to competition. And I'm going to go through a Tepper example because there are a number of different ways to think about who the customer is and how the school is positioned. So let's start out and we're going to talk about different types of segmentation. And the first is demographic segmentation. This is probably the most common. It characterizes customers on the basis of observable characteristics like how old you are, what your gender is, what your income is, and so on. And I'll go through examples of each. It's the simplest and most common way that markets are segmented. The second is geographic. And so you divide the market based on location. It could be rural, urban, as I'll explain. It could be by country. It depends upon the type of business or organization you're part of. And it helps the organization tailor their specific offerings. Psychographics is a little more complicated and focuses on the idea that consumers have different lifestyles, values, interests, attitudes. It was very popular in the 70s and 80s as a segmentation tool. It's more difficult to apply, and it's not easy to necessarily understand which psychographic group you're part of, but I'll give you an example out of the alcohol market. There's also behavioral segmentation, and this is what has really evolved. And what I mean by behavioral segmentation is how do you behave? What are your purchase habits? Are you brand loyal? How often do you use the product? Are you heavy, light users, and so on? And so there's 2 ways to think about it, who you are or what you do. Who you are comes through things like demographic segmentation. What you do is what behavioral segmentation is. And with the advent of a lot of sophisticated databases organizations like Google providing information about customers and what their interests are and so on, behavioral segmentation has really exploded. But we don't want to forget about the other types of segmentation. So behavioral segmentation, as I said, is what you do. A lot of the other segmentation tools are who you are. And then the last segmentation tool is something called benefit segmentation. And I'm a big fan of benefit segmentation. It focuses on what the customers are seeking, different types of benefits, such as ease of use or cost effectiveness. And I'll go through a number of examples. And let's go back and remember from the last lecture that there's a big difference between feature and benefits. Features are what the company often produces. Benefits are what the customer seeks. Or, as I said last time, what is in it for me? Why do I care? And so what's the benefit that I receive? And we've got, as marketers, we focus very heavily on the concept of benefits. So let me give you a couple of examples. And this isn't intended to be political, but it's going on, and there's so much information being provided right now about the 2024 election, particularly the presidential election. And when you read about what the different parties are doing, they're segmenting using demographic segmentation. They also do a lot with behavioral segmentation. I'll mention that in a minute. But do you think that there's a big difference in terms of what your voting behavior is, whether you're young or old, or young, middle-aged, and old? Income, high, medium, low. Education, like you, very well educated, or like a lot of people that live in rural America, very limited education. And then ethnicity, and then I could also add gender. There's a big gap right now between female and male voters. So the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are spending a lot of time thinking about which segments to go after. Do I go after rural America? So I'm Kamala Harris, I'm in Georgia, and do I go after the rural areas of Georgia? Or do I go into the areas where I have strength, which are the urban areas, particularly certain ethnic groups? And these are the decisions that the politicians and the political organizations have to make. And it is a very, very difficult question because you don't know how many people in, let's say, rural Georgia you can affect, and is it large enough to overcome the deficit that you may face in those areas. So the election is a great example of what's going on in terms of segmentation. I mentioned behavioral segmentation before, and I'm going to just use it for a second when we think about the election. The parties are able to get data on what your political affiliation is. If you sign up for primaries and you're a Democrat or a Republican, then they know that. They also, in certain ways, track what you've done historically. They may interview you and find out you're a staunch Democrat or a staunch Republican. That's a form of behavioral segmentation. What was your behavior? And then they're predicting if you're a Democrat, you'll vote Democratic. If you're a Republican, you'll vote Republican. What they care about is the group called independents or undecideds, and they have to figure out among undecideds where is their positioning and what's their opportunity. So as you're watching the election over the next month, think about how the parties are segmenting and what the impact is of their segmentation. Geographic is also another example, and the elections are a perfect example. Do I go urban, rural? Rural is very heavily Trump country. Urban is very heavily Kamala Harris country. And so the question, as I just raised, is what do we do? And then there's a lot of discussion about suburban moms. And so that's really a geographic segmentation along with an attitudinal segmentation. The next one is psychographic. So this is an old ad. I always have laughed about it because Jim Beam's actually a relatively low-end bourbon. But anyway, the taste is distinctive. The man is Sean Connery and the bourbon is Jim Beam. So why do I consume Jim Beam bourbon? Because Sean Connery has it, and I want to be like Sean Connery. So as you think about it, psychographic is really a powerful tool, but you can do it much more in terms of imagery, et cetera. I'm going to put up one other example, and it's an example that's slightly dear to my heart, and I'll explain it in a second. And that is the Marlboro Man. Now, smoking is not very popular anymore, but when I grew up, people smoked. And Marlboro started out as a female cigarette. It was targeted towards women. And it evolved, and they came up with the campaign. It was Leo Burnett, which was a big advertising agency in Chicago. And they came up with this advertising campaign, The Marlboro Man. And you ask yourself, what's it really about? Is it about the cigarette? Can you really identify that that's the cigarette that I really like because of the flavor? It was really because of the Marlboro Man. And the Marlboro Man transformed Marlboro cigarettes from an also ran into the number one brand of cigarettes in America. And it was these kinds of ads. The reason I said this is dear to my heart is not because I smoked, which I didn't, but because the man that does all this photography is actually a friend of ours. And he did the Marlboro photography for probably about 30 years and created this iconic image that they used in all of their advertising. So psychographics can be very powerful, and it fits a lot of categories where the quality of the product isn't as critical as the image of about the product. And cigarettes and alcohol, just going back real quickly, I mean, what does Sean Connery know about bourbon, and particularly Jim Beam, which was a relatively low-end bourbon? The next example is benefit segmentation. And benefit segmentation is a very commonly used tool. I'm going to give another example of it in a minute. But automobiles. So we have different kinds of cars that are reliable, cars that are sporty, safety, which is Volvo, rugged. I used an example recently in the videos of the Rivian, which is an electric vehicle, and it's a SUV as well as a truck. And what they're trying to advertise and trying to position themselves to be is the rugged SUV that's electric, and that's their positioning vis-a-vis Tesla. Excuse me. Tesla. And so Tesla is much more of a traditional car and SUV. They're trying to say, this is our segment that we really want to go after. Now, the question, and this goes back to the whole issue of targeting, is it a large enough segment? Can you make enough money positioning yourself as the rugged outdoor truck or SUV, which is what Rivian wants to do? I'll let you think about that, look at the data and so on. So the automobile industry uses really two types of segmentation. One is benefit segmentation, and the other is psychographic. The images of the car is very important. I drive a Mercedes because, or I drive a BMW because, but some of it's about the image of the people that drive it and what you think about their psychographic position. And then the last, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, is behavioral segmentation. One very simple way to think about it is heavy light users or heavy light and non-users. I'll give an example in a minute. Loyal or disloyal. The use of loyalty cards to reward loyal customers and provide lower prices to them. If you use an American Express Platinum card, then that card, in terms of you use it for certain purposes, but you also get certain benefits. And so it's linked to both benefit segmentation and behavioral segmentation. One of the concepts, and I think this is one of the most powerful concepts in marketing, is in really direct marketing, is something called RFM, recency frequency monitoring. With the kinds of databases that now exist that firms can have and use, they can actually calculate something called RFM, recency frequency monitoring. Recency means when did you last buy? Frequency is how often have you purchased? And monetary is how much have you spent? And so this combination is a very powerful segmentation tool. I learned it from the direct marketing industry, which has now evolved into the database marketing world. The organizations like Google, Amazon are very sophisticated at the way they can do this. We used to use fairly large segments, but the idea behind it is high recency means did you buy recently? Frequency is you're a heavy user, and monetary is you spend a lot of money. So what we want to do is we may want to offer special benefits to you. So if you're a heavy credit card user, you use it frequently, and you've used it recently, You may be part of what they call their preferred customer group, and then you get certain perks. You get better either miles, or in my case, I use credit cards where I get dollars back. And the result is that you end up being a preferred customer and you get certain benefits. You may get a higher percentage money back, et cetera. So the strategic issue when we start talking about targeting is going to be in RFM, do I go after segments that are recent, high frequency, high monetary, or do I do just the opposite and look at very infrequent users? I did some work for T. Rowe Price one time on their customer base. And the heavy users, the high recency frequency monetary groups, were not an issue. What they wanted to do was convert the medium to low frequency monetary groups to move into the higher frequency, higher monetary groups. And then what kind of incentives could they offer them to move into these groups? So RFM leads to very interesting questions about which segments do I then target. So as I said, the goal is to design different marketing and communication programs aimed at different recency frequency monetary groups. The major evolution, the big change in segmentation, and this is due to all the evolution of databases, is the following. It used to be that probably the primary form of segmentation was demographic segmentation, as I went through, like they're using in the election. But the big evolution is to one-on-one behavioral segmentation. So I wrote a book in 2007 with a couple of colleagues called Database Marketing, and I've been involved in that world for a long time, and I've seen the change. But this really highlights another critical issue in segmentation, which I mentioned earlier. Demographic segmentation is who you are. One-on-one behavioral segmentation is what you do. And the data and the information that we knew was behavioral segmentation is much more powerful because what you do is a much more important indicator than who you are. But the difficulty is, especially for startups, you don't have those kinds of databases. And so when I used to work for, I did a lot of work for retailers and their loyalty programs and their information about customers. You could do a lot with behavioral segmentation, but they were in existence. They had large databases. When you start, you don't have those kinds of databases. It's something that you should be planning on and thinking about, how do I develop a behavioral database? But you may have to segment using demographics, psychographics, or some of the other tools that we talked about. Let me just mention Tepper for a second, segmentation. What segmentations could you use for the Tepper MBA program? And I just listed some for you, just to make it concrete in terms of an area you may know something about. Demographics require engineering, math, and science background. So when I was a student at Tepper, when I was a student, it was called GSIA. We had to have an engineering, math, or science degree. So I had a math degree, so I could get in. It was interesting because that really narrowed the customer base. The school changed and went away from that. And the question is, was that a good decision or not? I'm not going to comment on it. Geographic target students from specific countries. So when I was at the University of Chicago, we knew that there were a lot of Eastern European students who were very well trained, who were very interested in applying to business schools. And the question is, how do we reach them? And then benefit segmentations offer joint degrees, and I'm going to come back to this, in AI or computer science and an MBA to increase the value of the graduates. So a combined degree may be very valuable. If you look at law students, a lot of law students, not a lot, some law students get a degree in both business, an MBA, and a law degree, and they feel that they're better positioned in the job market relative to other students. The steps in targeting are, the first is evaluation of segments. Marketers assess the potential of each segment to determine which ones are most viable and align with companies' goals and strategy. But this is really critical. The size of the segment, what kind of sales potential it has, and most importantly, what the competitive landscape is. In other words, where are the competitors vis-a-vis me? And this as I've said before, and this is really a critical issue. going back and asking yourself, do I really understand the competition? My general sense is entrepreneurs don't. And the reason I say that, and it's not to be negative, is that you often are so imbued with your product and you really think it's far superior to anything that exists in the marketplace. But is that what the customer thinks? And so when I look at the competitive landscape, I think I'm differentiated. Am I? The next step is then selecting which target segments to go after. We'll come back and I'll show you some examples. It's a difficult issue. And as I said, you may start out with one segment or one group of target segments, and then you may evolve to different ones because you've recognized that it's not as high a potential as you wished. Here's an example. So when I was at the University of Chicago, they asked me to work with the admissions office and figure out how we could develop a marketing strategy. And this was a number of years ago. The University of Chicago was falling far behind the competition in terms of applicants. It did well in terms of the image of the school, but because it was in Chicago, because it was in a not necessarily very nice area of Chicago, it had a lot of trouble attracting students. So I went to the director of admissions, and he and I conversed. I'll call it that. So his strategy, his target segments that he went after were schools with high GMAT scores. And so he felt that if we went after schools with high GMAT scores, this was ideal for the kinds of students that the University of Chicago wanted to attract. I raised the issue, should we go to schools with the highest number of students taking GMATs? So the example that I used was Caltech. Caltech had very high GMAT scores. So ETS, which did the GMATs, was able to provide us with information about every school in terms of their average GMAT scores and also the number of students taking the GMAT. So this was a critical database to us. So his name was Dennis. Dennis and I would go back and forth about this issue. Do you go to schools with high GMATs, or do you go to schools with a significant number of students taking the GMATs? This was a critical targeting decision. He had a budget. How many schools can he go visit? Which one does he go after? So Caltech was my example. Caltech had phenomenally high GMAT scores when you looked at their average. The problem was there were only 2 students taking the GMATs. He would go to California, he'd go to UCLA, he'd go to the Pomona and schools like that, and then he'd go to Caltech. The question was that a good strategy? So what I said was, we should really be looking at a different strategy. And it was a combination of geographic and demographic in the sense of the number of students taking the GMATs. What I showed him was that the schools in the Midwest, all the Big Ten, for example, Notre Dame and a few other schools like that, had a large number of students taking the GMATs, and they also had students who were willing to live in the Midwest. So one of the things I did with him was a little research, and we found that a lot of students that lived on the East Coast didn't particularly want to go to Midwestern schools. They didn't like the Midwest. The weather wasn't what they liked, et cetera. The difficulty with my strategy, which was to target schools with a high number of students, was how do you find them? How do you reach them? And it took time, and it was a strategy that required a long-term view, which was to start going to the engineering schools at the Big Ten. Notre Dame had a very good engineering school and so on, and start meeting the faculty, trying to convince them to have students apply to business schools and so on. So there was a whole sales strategy that he needed, which was to constantly be in contact with the various schools and so on, develop relationships and so on. Not easy. Ultimately, he did it. It did fairly well, and obviously there are a lot of things that changed in the University of Chicago. I don't think today has a big problem getting the number of students to apply like they did then. Another example of targeting that I'm going to let you think about is, suppose you're introducing a non-alcoholic wine. So I have somebody that I know that develops and sells and markets non-alcoholic wine. And when She mentioned it to me. I thought, well, that's interesting. How much demand is there for non-alcoholic wine? Turns out it's fairly significant. But how can we segment? What kind of segmentation can we use? Behavioral, can we look at light, medium, or non-users? So a big issue is with non-alcoholic wine, do you target non-users? Demographic, men versus women. Are women more likely or men more likely to use or want to consume non-alcoholic wine? Benefits, no hangover, safer to drive. So I looked up on the web and I asked the question on Google, who should we target? Here was an answer. The category is driven by younger consumers, most with families, who are more conscious of the choices they're making and what they're putting into their body, and it's becoming trendy and cool among peers. So I would not have thought that non-alcoholic wine would be that a significant category. It is growing very rapidly, and non-alcoholic beers as well. And I've been surprised how many people I know, when you go to a party, will serve non-alcoholic beverages. There's some people that don't drink alcoholic beverages, but also because of the fear of driving and a lot of other factors. This is and you may know more about it than I do, a rapidly emerging category. But what was interesting was it was among younger consumers. So when we think about targeting, this is really evolving non-alcoholic wine. It's an evolving category. But going back, let me just go back for a second. The question becomes, who do we target? And this is critical to the firms who are entering the market. One last comment. When I talk about something called a customer chain, it's really critical to think in terms of not only the end user, the people that are consuming the non-alcoholic wine, but the intermediaries like the wine stores and the beverage stores. They have to decide, do they want to carry these kinds of products? And then which types of organizations are you going to try to market this to? The largest or one of the largest sellers of alcoholic beverages is Costco, but they carry very few brands. Can you break into Costco if you're selling non-alcoholic wines? So this becomes a critical issue of not only selling the end user, but how do you get the intermediaries, in this case, retailers, to market your product? Another example of this is Kellogg versus the University of Chicago. And I apologize, these are so current in my mind for something else I'm doing. So the target is the prospective MBA student. The benefits sought, academic excellence, or employment opportunities. So I was at the University of Chicago. Business Week came out and did some of their first surveys. And what it showed was that Kellogg was number two. Number one was Dartmouth. Number two was Kellogg. And the University of Chicago was down at 6 or 7 or 8. And the dean of the University of Chicago was really upset about this, obviously felt that the University of Chicago was far superior to Northwestern. Whether it was or wasn't is a different question. So one of the issues became Kellogg targeted recruiters focused on a benefit, managerial jobs. The University of Chicago's positioning was focused on a feature, Nobel Prize winners in academic excellence. So when I was at the University of Chicago, there were probably 5 faculty members in the finance and economics area who won the Nobel Prize, like Gene Fama, who you may know that name, or Myron Scholes, the Black-Scholes model, or Mert Miller. And so the University of Chicago is very proud of that and should have been and is. But the question is that what the students wanted? Now, when you're a PhD student, which I did after I got an MBA, that really matters because you want to be part of an organization like that, because what it's talking about is academic excellence as the benefit, not the feature. But for MBA students, what the dean at Kellogg, his name was Don Jacobs. Don Jacobs spent a lot of time meeting with recruiters and figuring out what the issue was and what they needed. And so even in the selection process at Kellogg, they identified and did a lot of interviewing and identified certain types of students that they felt would do well in terms of recruiters And then that was their strategy in terms of how they identified and positioned the school vis-a-vis the University of Chicago. And unbeknownst to us at the University of Chicago at the time, Northwestern was really doing well, and we didn't realize it. Obviously, the world changed, and business schools are not quite the same as they were back when this story took place. So the last topic I'm going to cover is positioning. This is a difficult concept to really get your hands around and very difficult to execute. I've got a 5-step process that I go through when I think about positioning. The first is, who is the target audience? Who is your ideal customer? This could include demographics, psychographics, etc. Category definition, the product or service or category that your brand operates in. What's the key benefit? And this goes back to what I talked about last time about a USP. What is it that uniquely lets us stand out vis-a-vis the competition? The fourth is a differentiator. Explain what makes your brand unique and different from your competitors. And then lastly, what's the reason to believe? Provide evidence or reasons why the target audience should believe your differentiation claim. I'm going to just mention airlines for a second. Unfortunately, we could go and spend all day talking about the airlines, but I'm sure a lot of you fly. You take an airline like United, whose tagline was, "Fly the friendly skies." Think about that. So I'm going to go back and just mention this. Target audience, who are they going after? Well, they're probably going after almost everybody. Category definition, that one's relatively easy. The product or service category is airlines and transportation. Key benefit. So in this case, to them, the key benefit is friendliness. So when you get on the plane, the service and everything, it's a positive experience. Differentiator, they felt that other airlines didn't offer this. And then, and this is the critical issue, reason to believe. So can you believe, what is it that United does that makes it the friendly skies? And the answer was, not much. That's the difficulty. So you get on an airplane, and the first thing you do is you check in at the gate, and that's not necessarily a very interesting or fun experience, or you go through a long line just to get through TSA. Then you get to the gate, and they're giving you all kinds of announcements, you can only have one carry-on, et cetera. And so you go back and you start asking yourself, are they delivering on that brand promise? And I want you to think about that. Easy to create a brand promise that you can't deliver on. So going back to the University of Chicago Northwestern, Don Jacobs, the dean at Kellogg, figured out how to really focus on how am I going to deliver on the brand promise of the kinds of students that the recruiters wanted. So he recognized that the benefit that a lot of MBA students, the reason they go to school is not so much so that they can get a sophisticated academic education, but what they wanted was a good job. And so the result was that for him, they recognized that, or what he recognized was one of his customers were the recruiters. And if he could influence the recruiters and demonstrate to the recruiters that he could provide students that provided the kind of benefit that they wanted, then the school would be successful. And he was phenomenally successful. So let's just go back to MBAs because I'm going to just do this one more time. Last MBA story. Option 1 and option 2 in terms of category definition. One way to think about it is, do I want to target people who want a joint degree, or do I want to target people who want a traditional MBA? So you're the dean at Tepper, and you have to make this kind of decision. Now, you may create 2 different types of programs. I don't want to spend much time on that right now. Key benefit is significant increase in income, business training. So the increase in income is the benefit from what many MBA students want. I go to school, I'm spending $100,000 or $80,000 if I didn't get a scholarship. Am I really going to have a significant increase in my income? Am I going to get the kind of job that I want where I'm going to have an interesting career, et cetera? Or are we in the business of providing business training? As a professor, and I was a professor for a long time at Chicago Northwestern, we focus very heavily on our academic expertise, how many articles did you write, what kinds of books did you write, and so on. That probably was relevant to the students, but number one, at least in my experience, was the students cared about what was the incremental income and life that I was going to have because I went through an MBA program. The next is differentiator. So for Carnegie and Tepper, having somebody who's preeminent in computer science and AI and related topics, linking to my joint MBA might be a real differentiator versus most of the students who are out in the marketplace. And then the key benefit is, hopefully, because we go through these kinds of programs, we get significantly higher starting salaries, which is something that's published all the time. So what you can do is you can create something which I call a positioning map. And let me just show you this. So this is something that a lot of the organizations, the big marketing companies, do for their products or services. So I created a positioning map, and this is just based on intuition, managerial orientation and technical orientation. So I have schools like Harvard, very high in managerial orientation, but technical skills, it's not really very focused on it. Kellogg, a little less in managerial skills, but a little more on technical education. The University of Chicago, particularly in things like finance, very sophisticated technical orientation, and also obviously managerial. And then Tepper, probably less on managerial. The dean's probably going to shoot me for saying this. And then, but higher on technical skills. This is option one. Going back to my options, this is a traditional MBA program. Suppose we change this to option two, which is a joint degree. And I call this, the axes are unique skills and a 21st business demand orientation. So is the world going to start, is the recruiting world, and it may be a segment of the recruiting world, wanting to find people who have a 21st century business education and unique skills? If we look at the map on that, Harvard's going to be low on that. It's going to have a moderately sophisticated education. Kellogg may be a little lower, University of Chicago, and here's Tepper. So this is an example of trying to figure out what's our positioning and who are we going after. And if we think about it, this is a critical decision that the dean's office has to make. They have to decide what kinds of programs are we offering in the marketplace. Now, when you think about a school like Chicago, Northwestern, Harvard, Stanford, et cetera, they're very large. They have a significant number of graduates. I mean, when I was teaching at Northwestern, we probably had 1,000 graduates a year. Tepper's not even close. And so its pool of alums, which I am, when I went to Tepper, it was a very small school. It's a small alumni group, et cetera. It has to figure out how it can be a niche player and differentiate itself, at least in my mind. So if I were the dean, which they haven't asked me to be recently, is I would spend all my time trying to figure out how are we differentiated and what do we do in terms of that. And I think the Carnegie CMU link in computer science and engineering in a number of technical areas, it becomes a real opportunity in terms of differentiation, and joint degrees may be a big opportunity. Now that's a casual set of observations. I haven't done any research on this, and that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to teach you, get you to think about is, one, do we target a different world, which in this case is joint degree students and so on? And secondly, do we position ourselves uniquely relative to that so that we're a different type of business school? And when you come to our school, this is how you think about it. Now, going back to my example of Northwestern versus Chicago, one thing I would be spending all my time on is trying to talk to all the recruiters and recruiting opportunities for our students and finding out, is this the right kind of positioning? Is this what the market demands? Is there a real opportunity? And is this going to be how the world of business schools is going to evolve? So there'll be what we'll call traditional business schools, and there will be unique players. And Tepper could be very well positioned as a unique player. So let me summarize, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and let you ask me questions. You should now be an expert in STP. Of course, I'm being a little facetious. As you know, there are a lot of different ways to segment a market. And what I want you to be able to do as you're thinking about the businesses that you want to develop, how am I segmenting the market? Where do I position myself? How do I fit? And selecting the target requires a deep understanding of the customer. So I'm Johnny One Note in the sense that I just constantly keep emphasizing the importance of talking about understanding the customer and the customer chain. The dean at Kellogg, Don Jacobs, understood that it wasn't just the students. The customer was the recruiter. And I have to understand that recruiter and start working back to what kinds of students does that mean? What does it mean in terms of our programs? And how do we differentiate ourselves vis-a-vis the competition? And he did a fantastic job. And he was a finance professor. He wasn't a marketing professor, but he had a good intuition about business. And as I said before, knowledge of the competition. How are they positioned relative to us? How can we beat University of Chicago, Northwestern, Stanford, et cetera, Wharton, Harvard? It's very difficult. These are traditional, well-established business schools. And when we try to be like them, we can't compete. So with that, I think there's one more slide, but it's, oh, here it comes. So positioning is the most difficult part of STP. Easy to develop a positioning, but will it be effective? And is it consistent with the organization's ability to deliver on the promise being made? So if we want to have joint degrees and have unique students, can we deliver on that? And can we position it effectively vis-a-vis the competition? I'll let you think about that. So I'm going to end, open it up for questions. Sun's in my eyes here, unfortunately. I'm going to
have a question
for 1 second. The sun's in my eyes. All right.
It's good here. Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you if you could give us an example of how to do this kind of segmentation in a B2B business.
That's a good question. So let's just go back to different methodologies. The first one is demographics. Can we think about demographics for businesses? Well, the answer is yes. In fact, it's probably the primary way businesses do it. What industry, segmenting based on industry, segmenting on the basis of size. But I also want to spend a second, when you think about B2B, you also, going back to what I was talking about with respect to the customer chain, what that means is that in a B2B business, you have potentially the user, but the user may not be the decision maker. So the decision maker may be the CFO of the company because the CFO reviews contracts. The decision maker could be the purchasing agent who is deciding which companies we do business with. And so the end user and the intermediary, which is the purchasing agent, the CFO, those are all part of the customer chain, and you have to think about it. Now, going through some of the other kinds of segmentation we talked about, geographic, I think that's relatively easy to think about. Are we going to target certain businesses in certain geographies? We can look at benefits. What are the benefits we're providing versus the competition? So easy to, in many respects, it's easier for B2B segmentation because you can think about things like size of business, geographic, industry type, and so on. And there's a lot of data about it.
Hi, my question is, do we have to have all the answers before we before we launch or pivot?
The answer is the more you have, the better off you are. Now, I'm stating the obvious. I would not start a business without having spent time thinking through what we just talked about, STP, which segments am I going to go after, et cetera. And trying to look at alternatives and asking myself, if I go after segment A, am I better off, or segment B, et cetera? Let's go back to, just because I used it as an example, non-alcoholic wine. I want to launch a non-alcoholic wine. Who am I going after? Am I going after the heavy wine consumer? Am I going after young, and so on? The answer is that's critical to think in terms of. Think in terms of which segments and how is it segmenting and who am I going after? And then how am I positioned vis-a-vis other competitors? So which I'm offering a Pinot Noir, non-alcoholic wine. How many other non-alcoholic Pinot Noirs are there, and how am I differentiated? The answer may be not at all. Now, you're raising an important question. After I do the segmentation, I then select some target segments. I may have to pivot. But what you want to do is you want to try to do as much analysis a priori, because if you don't think about it before the fact and just throw it out there and then hope you're going to start to figure it out, it's a very risky strategy, because you will use a lot of resources and you haven't really thought through, how am I going to use these resources? I understand, and I've developed and started businesses, that you have to be very careful of how you use your initial resources so that you can pivot. But I think the more you can do the analysis up front, this goes into what we've been talking about, and I've been talking about nonstop, customer research and understanding how they think about it. And if you don't do that kind of customer research and then competitor research, if I were looking at your business plan, I would say that you haven't really thought through what your strategy is going to be.
Anybody else? Someone going in. I just have a question on the crosshairs. I know a lot of students have questions on how to pick the two best axes. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Where does it come from? You have to understand something about the consumer. So you have to, the way you identify those axes is through some consumer research. So and competitor research, understanding how the competitors are located and so on. So going back to the business school example, we could look at managerial versus technical, which is probably the most common way people think about business schools. But I raised the issue of, are there some alternative ways to think about it? And the idea was that maybe we can look at joint degrees, non-joint degrees, technical, non-technical, and think about how businesses might evolve. Now, where does that come from? That comes from doing some research on the marketplace. Excuse me. And as your question's implying, which I think is a good question, it's difficult to decide what those axes are. And you may want to look at multiple different ways of setting those axes, and then how are you positioned? So the example I gave two different ways to think about it. I'm not saying one or the other is better. Then I want to go out in the marketplace and try to understand which is the better way to position.
Thank you.
Hi, Robert. I have a question. I'm just wondering that after you launch and you've already come up with an STP strategy. So after you launch, how will you analyze that, whether your STP strategy works? And then if it failed, how will you modify your strategy?
All right. So the way I evaluate how am I doing, there are two, and there'll be multiple ways to look at it. But one is obviously, what are my sales by the different segments? But secondly, going back and starting to interview customers after the fact, after you've introduced, and find out, how do they really think about your product? Are they satisfied with your product? Do they like your product? Why are they buying it? Why aren't they buying it? And so on. What kinds of repeat buying are you getting from the customers? How much is it costing me to acquire customers, and so on, if you can do those calculations for the business. If it isn't working, then what you've got to do is go back and study the different segments and say, are there segments that offer opportunities? And then if that's difficult to identify, do I try to think about a different way to segment the market? So we start out and potentially we say, well, let's look at the market demographically. So we're going to target non-users of red wine or non-users of non-alcoholic wine. And then we start to realize that that hasn't worked and non-users aren't very interested in non-alcoholic wines. Then we go back and say, should we look at heavy users, light users, and so on? But we may recognize that we should be looking at a benefit segmentation, and that the benefit that this product offers is it allows us to go to parties, stay a long time, drink heavily, and drive home. Or it may be that it's much better for my lifestyle. So now there's research coming out that if you're older, you shouldn't drink alcohol. I don't know whether it's true or it isn't true. And so suddenly this is a big opportunity that has evolved. And then you start positioning as good for you, enjoyable, all the benefits of wine, but not the bad aspects of it. And so you may want to think about different segmentation or different segments that you may want to target.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Anybody online, feel free to unmute if you have a question. Okay, if you want to come up, we have one more in person.
Hi.
They are on the Connect's website.
Hello again. My other question is, how should we structure our marketing approach based on this framework, heavy versus light consumers? Like how should we differentiate our approach?
So one of the critical issues is communications. How do I reach consumers? And so if I'm looking at light versus heavy, the answer may be that light users have different types of media use versus heavy users. So let's just, since we're using wine as an example, heavy users of wine may get online and spend a lot of time searching different kinds of vineyards and wineries that they're interested in going. They may want to go to Europe and visit Italy or France or wherever. The light users may just rely on going to the local liquor store, and hopefully there's one where they have somebody who has some knowledge about wine and say, well, I've got a party tonight, and how do I communicate this? I mean, what do I buy? And then in effect, the sommelier at the wine store is explaining, well, you've got 10 people coming over, you're serving this. I'd recommend a Sancerre. And you go, well, I don't even know what a Sancerre is. And he says, well, this is a sophisticated, very good white wine from France. And you go, oh, okay. And he says, I've got a special promotion on it today. And, it's only $29 or whatever the price is. Now, unfortunately, you live in a state where there's state liquor stores, but the rest of the world understands how to sell liquor. So anyway, so the strategy would be, if you're going after heavy users, you better be focusing on bloggers and people that are communicating sophisticated wine information and so on. If you're going for the light user, you may want to set up ways to meet with and visit the influencers at the local liquor stores and beverage stores that are selling a wine. So the strategy could be very different. That's just an example. So it has a big impact on communications. It has a big impact on distribution. How are you going to try to distribute your product? If you're a B2B, because I had a question about B2B, you may want to think about the fact that my sales organization, I want to separate my sales organization into certain types of industries so they have much more knowledge of those specific industries, what their needs are, and what the issues are in that industry. So they're expert on how to sell industry A versus industry B. And so the communication strategy, the distribution strategy, and then obviously the positioning strategy are all influenced by which segments you go after.